Good morning, Toastmasters, District 47. My name is Lois Margola, and welcome to the last day, she says with a sigh, of the Virtual Empowerment Weekend. I'll be your facilitator, and we're going to go over some housekeeping items that if you don't know by now, here's your chance to learn. You will be muted and unable to mute yourself until our presenter asks you to be unmuted or the presentation is over. Your video has the opportunity to be on. We encourage you to turn on your video so Luiz can feel the love and know that everything is good and that you are connecting with him. At the end of the session, I will post a evaluation link in the chat window. From there, let's go ahead and introduce our amazing presenter. Luiz Bravim has taught, trained, and managed students, faculties, and staff around the world. Luiz is a two-time District 47 speech champion. Talk about an overachiever? Take a look. He won in evaluations and table topics. So it's not even the same contest. Have you realized that? How important is that? His specialty is motivational speaking with multinational audiences. Luiz has spoken at over 30 Toastmaster clubs in 5 states, 4 countries, and 3 continents. He is a member of Gelfand Good Morning Toastmasters in Hollywood, Florida. Please help me welcome Luiz Bravim.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lois, and thank you for all the district personnel that helped put this together. I promise that I will be efficient and get you right back to your Sunday morning plans, whatever they may be. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Luiz Bravim, and today we're going to focus on how to avoid stereotypical and gendered language. It's something that I've heard my entire life listening to speeches and presentations, and even very, very talented and experienced speakers fall into this trap. So we're gonna look at why, and then what are some strategies to get out of this gendered and stereotypical language trap. First things first, I wanna start with how we all start as children. So just take a look at this video for the next 3 minutes, and then we'll discuss it afterward.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
I want to be, I never thought of that. Let me think about that. Whoa.
I want to be a teacher when I grow up.
Elementary teacher. I like little kids.
A babysitter.
A pastor.
Dolphin trainer.
A gentle that eats bugs. A haircutter.
A person who helps in charities.
Only cashier at Walmart.
An author. Chapter books about mythical creatures and animals and things.
I want to be a lawyer.
Lawyer.
Pilot. Pilot. And a dad. A pilot racer dad.
Scientist.
Scientist. Paleontologist. Mine for dinosaur bones and studies them.
YouTuber.
Movie star.
A famous actor.
Actor. On stage.
On TV.
On Disney Channel.
Or commercials. I gotta be a model.
I'll work it.
If I weren't a model, I'll just be a policeman. Police officer. A cop.
I want to car chases.
Catch bad guys. A superhero. Batman. Spider-Man.
I would like to go into the U.S. Army because my grandma, she loved the Army, but she never went into the service.
I want to be the 3rd African-American gymnast. Gymnastic coach. I want to be a professional dancer.
Dance teacher.
Ballerina.
Professional soccer player. I have a shirt on right now that's for Barcelona.
Soccer player.
Basketball player.
Basketball, football, or soccer player.
Or baseball. I can never choose.
I do not know.
I'm still working on that.
Maybe when I grow up, I'll pick.
I already have a whole plan. Serve the Air Force for 20 years, become a businessman, make my own company for cars. I want to be a Pokemon trainer. I want to work at Target.
I want a cake. I want to be a pop star, rock star, singer.
I want to be a cook, but I don't really know how to actually cook. I want to be an artist. Painter.
I want to be an artist that goes around painting walls.
An artist and a video game maker.
Video game designer. I want to be a filmmaker. Whatever my dad is.
Do you know what your dad is?
I'm not sure. I'll be a doctor. Doctor. A mermaid. A mermaid doctor. Heart surgeon. Neurosurgeon.
Cardiologist.
Gynecologist. Pediatrician, the kids doctor. Pediatrician.
And why do you want to do that?
I want to be a doctor and then I can wear rainbow sweatpants.
I really want to be a nurse. Everyone says you have to be very good at science and math. I'm not really, but I still want to be one.
I want to be a pet doctor because I like helping animals. Pet veterinarian. Zoologist. Princess Fairy zookeeper.
How much do you think to get paid?
$29.
So the point of watching that video is to show, and most of you already know this, that when we're young, and especially children, young children, we have unlimited dreams, unlimited possibilities that are not grounded by anything that's here and now. But as we get older, we start becoming more limited. And I think language has a role in limiting our dreams. So today we're going to talk about something that's been known in psychology for a long time, the schema. And the schema is a concept that helps us organize and interpret information. All people from all cultures of the world have schema. It's not something that's unique to one group. And what schema allows us to do is to take shortcuts, interpreting the vast amount of information that's available in our everyday environment. There are far too many sights, sounds, smells, and stimuli for us to actually be aware and cognizant of everything around us. So the schema filters out most non-essential information and keeps us focused on those things that are most relevant to our everyday experience. But there's a danger. And the danger is that in filtering out most of the information that's available in our everyday environment, we also fall victim to stereotyping, which is part of schema. And this makes it hard to retain information that doesn't conform to our ideas about the world. I'll give you a really simple example. You might have a friend named Barney, and maybe Barney is a really fun person to be around, practical joker, always the first one to tell the joke of the day at the meeting. But one day, Barney is just upset. He doesn't feel like joking around. He's morose, no smile on his face. Now, our schema of Barney is of a happy-go-lucky, jocular, jovial, fun person. And when we find information that doesn't fit in with our schema, we tend to ignore it or discount it. And this schema can be about a person, it can be about a country, it can be about a gender or a specific role that is exercised in society. And that turns out to be a really dangerous thing for people, and especially for public speakers. Public speakers connect. That's the job. You're not speaking for yourself. You're speaking for an entire audience, whether it's 5 people or 10,000 people. And to the extent that you don't connect, then a speaker isn't doing their job. Stereotyping is a way of disconnecting from the part of the audience that doesn't really fit in with that stereotype, even if it's unintentional. And I believe that most of the time when we do stereotype, it's completely unintentional. We're not even aware that we're doing it because we live our lives with this filter called the schema. And stereotyping is actually embedded in the English language. The English language isn't the only one that has a good deal of stereotyping, but it's the one that we're all fluent in and working with today. So I'm going to focus on that. Let's take a look at some of the linguistic progress that has been made from, let's say, the 1950s and 60s to today. We went from having policemen on the streets to police officers. We went from firemen protecting the community to firefighters. We went from a mailman to a mail carrier, a congressman to a member of Congress, and went from describing our species as that of man or mankind to humans, people, or humanity. So you can see how gender is really embedded in the language and how long it takes to disentangle that gendered normative language from the reality of our everyday experience in the 21st century. But these are just a few words that show the nature of gender within language. There are actually thousands and thousands of words that stereotype by their very structure, even without the person wanting to stereotype. The word itself stereotypes. Speakers generalize and stereotype all the time. I've seen it in Toastmasters. I've seen it in very high-level business meetings and on the radio and television and popular culture. So in preparing for this presentation, I took a long, hard look at the United Nations suggestions for gender-inclusive language. A lot of this presentation is based on the guidelines they recommend. Now, whatever your personal opinion about the United Nations is, they do include over 180 different nations and have relationships between all those nations. And so they're very much accustomed to going with cross-cultural communication and are also very focused on avoiding unintentionally offending a certain group or a certain gender or race or nationality. And so I took their suggestions to heart. One thing that some of you may have noticed is that increasingly we see pronouns being advertised with the names of speakers or conference attendees. And these pronouns, 99% are pretty straightforward: he, him, she, her. But there are also other conceptions of gender which are not represented by the standard he, him, she, her. So we're going to take very good care not to exclude any part of that audience, whether it's 1% or 5% or 10%. I want you to read this sentence for just a moment. Can anyone share with me any issues that they found with this sentence, if they found an issue at all? All right, you might all still be muted. I'll go ahead and answer my own question because I don't know if you can unmute yourself at this point. There is an issue. Oh, are we unmuted?
Can I answer? Can I answer?
Absolutely, yes, go ahead.
Okay, every reference to a person in this sentence says men, and there could be women who contributed funds, and there could be women who were injured firemen and injured policemen. So I think another word, a business person and fire personnel or whatever, but those three words are unacceptable.
You hit it right on the head. What this sentence is doing is both stereotyping and excluding at the same time, something that a speaker never, ever wants to do. And so we see this gendered language, which is considered old-fashioned, but still in use regularly on newspapers and magazines and television, and even in everyday conversation. So regardless of the state of discrimination and stereotyping in the world, we want to take care to be examples as Toastmasters and as public speakers in our communities. We don't want to follow that, however prevalent it may be. So like our volunteer said, we can change some of these nouns, businessmen, firemen, and policemen, to make them much more inclusive. We can say business community. That would be just one of many terms we could use. We could say firefighters and police officers, which has become the norm. So it's not that hard to switch from gender exclusive language to gender inclusive language. But I wanted to take a closer look at how many people we're actually excluding when we use gender restrictive terminology. We exclude 11.6 million female entrepreneurs when we use gendered language like businessman. And that's just 11.6 million in the United States, to say nothing of the female entrepreneurs around the world. that also contribute to the economy and make their communities a better place. So imagine just shifting one word, and we now include 11.6 million more people. Really simple change, but effective. We also exclude 100,000 female police officers. Once again, this is just in the United States when we use terms like policeman. And 93,700 firefighters, female firefighters, we exclude when we say things like fireman. And if you just add all that together, you're talking about 12 million more people who are included merely by adjusting the language we use, whether it's in speech or in writing. And I think taking a little bit of extra effort when we're in the planning stages of our public speaking is well worth including 12 million more people. That's more connections we can make. That's a more effective message that we can deliver to a much larger audience. I'm not going to get too much into the fluid nature of gender in the 21st century. That's not my purpose here, but you should be aware that amongst the younger generation, there are far more gender options and gender identities than there would have been in the 1950s and 60s and 70s when some of these stereotypes became embedded in the language that we use. And I think it was an article I read in the New York Times just a couple weeks ago that said Facebook had over 70 options for gender. I'm on Facebook, and I didn't even know there were that many options for gender, nor would I be able to identify them all. But once again, it shows the importance of including everybody, not just those that fit in with some sort of construct that we've become used to over time. So what I want to do for the rest of today is actually put the English language on trial. And we're going to start with the pronouns he, him. Although I was looking at particular roles and jobs like policemen and congressmen and so on, dated and gendered terms, I think one of the most common offenders in the English language is actually substituting he, him, his for everyone, including the 51% of people in the world who do not identify as he or him, but it has become so generalized that it sometimes represents an entire species of many different genders rather than just males. English lacks a gender-neutral singular pronoun. We say typically he or him to refer to a boy, she or her to refer to a girl or a woman, but we don't have a singular pronoun to use when we're unsure of the gender of the person we're speaking about. And we might be unsure because we've never met that person or because the person hasn't been identified yet. But whatever it is, it poses a real problem for people conversing in the English language. So what is the alternative that we can use for a singular person when we don't have a gender-neutral pronoun and yet we want to talk about that person? Maybe we don't even know the person's name yet. What can we do to combat this problem? And anyone who feels like they have an answer can share.
There's a couple of comments in there. You can say it, they.
Well, we don't want to say it. It would be offensive. We usually use it for someone that's not a human. It would be a plant. It would be a lamp. It would be a pencil. To refer to somebody as an it, I think would be pretty offensive and derogatory, whoever that person may be, whatever their gender is. Now, we can use they, and that seems to be the preferred shortcut these days. But remember, they is actually plural. They refers to more than one person. So we still run into this issue of English not having a gender-neutral singular pronoun, which is an issue that I've run into time and time again. So if we don't know, should we default to him or her? Should we default to he or she? And the United Nations has some pretty good tips for how we can avoid this problem. So one of the tips that the United Nations gives is to use plural pronouns. Like one of our volunteers in the chat suggested. But we can say, before submitting your document, send it to the focal point for their review. They will return it to you with comments. Now, they may be a singular person, but we don't know who that person is. So if we say he, we're excluding half the audience. If we say she, we're excluding another half of the audience. If we say it, we're dehumanizing the audience. And so they, although not traditionally grammatical, might still work in many cases. Another option would be to use the he/she, which was very popular in the 80s and the early 90s, but it's also a little bit awkward, whether we're reading it, and definitely awkward to say he, she, or she, he. And one of the issues with the he/she is that the male pronoun typically comes first, which in itself is a problem, because why are we always going to default to the he first when we know that at least half of the population doesn't conform to that? Less inclusive, a staff member in Antarctica earns less than he would in New York. I see this all the time. I hear it at my workplace. I see it when I go to conferences in different cities and states, and I also see it in the newspaper when I'm reading. We use somebody who is not identified and automatically go with the masculine pronoun. You can use the pronoun one, which sounds a little bit more formal, but at least it doesn't divide or stereotype or exclude our audience. A staff member in Antarctica earns less than one in New York. Works very, very nicely. The United Nations also tells us that we can use the pronoun who. Instead of saying, if a complainant is not satisfied with the board's decisions, he can ask for a rehearing. Well, what if the complainant is not a he? You can say, a complainant who is not satisfied with the board's decision can ask for a rehearing. And this is a really elegant substitution because we're not using a double word or a longer word. It's still monosyllabic. It flows really nicely, and it includes everyone rather than excluding half of the population. You can also use a plural antecedent, which makes the they and the themselves flow much more nicely. A substitute judge must certify that he has familiarized himself. We can switch that. Substitute judges. We went from singular to plural, but now the they and themselves is really fluid and it sounds so clean without the awkward nature of taking a singular noun and making it the plural they. So I like this method as well of including everybody in the audience. We can also omit the gendered word entirely. Instead of saying request the emergency relief coordinator to continue his/her efforts, we can take that away. Request the emergency relief coordinator to continue efforts to strengthen the coordination of humanitarian assistance. We still get the idea of the sentence. We've communicated effectively, but we've taken away that problem of what gendered pronoun to use if we should try to use it. And there are actually many more strategies that the United Nations suggests. I did not include all of them. I just picked a few that I think work really well for public speakers. The goal is not to complicate speech. It's already complicated enough. We have to adapt to Zoom. We have audiences that we can't see all at once. Body language is limited by camera angles and the setting in which we're speaking. I don't want to complicate speech any more than it already is. Instead, I want to make the speech that we already use much, much more effective and inclusive. It's good politics, and it's also the most professional thing to do. We want to maximize speaking via inclusion, and we want to err on the side of inclusion. And that includes taking great, great precautions not to misgender any person in the audience. This can be terribly offensive. Misgendering is when we call somebody who identifies as one gender by another gender. And this is usually accidental, but some people do it on purpose. If they notice somebody who's trans and for whatever reason don't want to call that person by the proper pronoun, then they will just call them whatever they think is right or they think is convenient, when in actuality, gender is something that people identify as for themselves. It's extremely personal. And by misgendering somebody, you are alienating that person. And I read one statistic that showed 3 out of 5 people who are trans will be misgendered. That's a great majority, and it's something that we want to avoid. If you're curious about learning more about the United Nations suggestions and tips, I put a nice QR code for you guys on the left-hand side. Many of you have QR code readers on your smartphone, or if you have an iPhone or an iPad, you can just use your camera app and go straight to the web page where I got a lot of the information on this presentation. And I also have a link, or you could just Google gendered languages and the United Nations suggestions will pop up. Just in case you have a specific question for me, but don't want to answer at the end of this talk, because there's over 100 people, you can always contact me by email, luiz.bravim@gmail.com, or you could also tweet me and direct message me over here. I'm happy to answer any questions. By no means am I an expert on not using gendered language, but I have put considerable thought and done some research, and I'm happy to have that discussion with you. Now, perhaps the more fun part of the presentation, I would happily take any questions from the audience that you have about using stereotypical or gendered language in speechcraft.
Okay, well, there is certainly a lot of chatter going on, and sometimes we've got Haley who is saying, I still defer to the plural when there is a doubt. Sounds like you can't go wrong with that.
That's true. I agree with that. If you defer to the plural, you might be in a grammatically awkward situation, but you're not going to exclude anybody. So I would say that's a safe choice.
So I would like to bring something up. I belong to an online club that has people from across the world, and we've gotten to the point that some people get very offended by things that our speakers will say and not realize that they're saying that's offensive. So we actually do a statement in the beginning from our Sergeant at Arms that says, you know, this is an inclusive club. However, we have people from all around the country. Please be careful of, you know, the language that you're using. And inevitably, we're still going to get people that say things that they don't realize are offensive to other cultures. Have you seen that elsewhere? And if so, how do they combat that?
That was a long question, Lois. I'll try to take bits and pieces of it. Whenever you have a large multinational audience, you're going to get different sorts of levels of education and sensitivity about the issue of using gender in language. And I'll give you an example. In many Romance languages, gender is actually embedded even in nouns that are not people. So a table in many languages might have a gender, whether feminine or masculine. English doesn't have this issue of as much gender embedded in language that is not consist of actual people. But I would say that a public speaker has to be very sensitive not to offend audiences that come from more conservative places where the LGBTQ community might not have rights or recognition. And that's why I probably would not give this presentation in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, because there's not the same level of LGBTQ protections, and gender is still viewed as binary, either male or female. That's just being respectful of your audience. And I think a good public speaker will always do that, whether or not you politically agree with what is represented in that audience. You should be aware of it. Now, I think in a Toastmasters convention where we get people from over 100 countries, we still want to use the rule of thumb of error on the side of inclusion rather than exclusion. And that's because we do have people in the LGBTQ community, even in these very conservative countries. And that might be the only time, you might be the only speaker that recognizes them for who they are. And you may never even know that you did that, but just by taking a few moments to think about it, an error on the side of inclusion rather than exclusion, I think you've done your job as a speaker.
Thank you. So we do have from Patty Loveland. She was wondering if you could throw up on your screen the United Nations website again. Would you
Sure,
mind?
I will happily do that. I'll share my screen again. All right.
And while you're showing that, Patricia Stevenson asked, are style books allowing for they, them, or is it still he for everyone?
So it's been a while since I've been in college and taken a good look at one of those style manuals that we all did in Comp 101 or whatever English class you took. Last I saw, Strunk and White, which is a pretty good style manual, did not have a specific section addressing this issue, but it's been a really long time. It's been over 15 or 16 years since I've taken a look, and I would hope that the newer editions do take into account using the plural when that gender neutral pronoun is unavailable, which we know it's unavailable in the English language. It would never be acceptable. So I would say that they has become the pronoun of choice.
Okay, I have from Price Polynice. If gender is personal, why is it left to us to be correct? Why can the person identify themselves to us? Which kind of dovetails into something Nardia Aldridge said, which is she would actually ask someone how they would like to be addressed.
That's a great question from Price. I know that it is difficult at times when we're in a large group and we don't know everybody. This is why it's becoming the norm, both on social media and in professional situations, to have your preferred pronoun on your name tag. And that's true on college campuses, in orientation. It's true in professional networking association. It's becoming standard. And so if you simply look at a good name tag, you might see the preferred pronoun on there. And if you don't see it on there because it's not part of that community, then you can simply ask. But I would avoid assuming, especially in the instance in which you're wrong. And like I said before, 3 out of 5 trans people have been misgendered. And that's unacceptable. That's 60% of a contingent of people that might be part of your audience.
Okay. Our next question is from Dr. Susan Vanetta. How do we incorporate into our introductions in Toastmasters? So we say Mr., Madam, Toastmaster. What would you recommend?
That's another great question. And there is a problem with the titles we use for women in the English language. We tend to use Miss, which is traditionally an unmarried female, or Mrs., which is traditionally a married or sometimes an adult female. But the corollary to that, Mr., doesn't identify somebody's relationship status or marital status. So in many circles, Ms., MS, period, without the ISS or the R, is a preferred designation when we don't know the person's choice, because Ms. takes into account all different ages, all different marital statuses, and relationship statuses. And I would say that it's best if the person in the speaker introduction reveals for themselves what they want to be called. Personally, I'm never Mr. Bravim unless I'm around kids. I'm Luiz Bravim. I just prefer to use my name, and I don't need any title before that. But some people do prefer having a title, and so I would say they should include that in their speaker intro.
Okay, well, hold on to your hats for this one.
Yes, go ahead.
Referencing races has changed over time, and this individual says they always struggle being politically correct. Is there any hints you can give, or would you like to pass on that?
I'm sorry, referencing races?
Races has changed over time, and they are struggling to be politically correct referencing that. Is there any tips that you can give on that?
There are no tips that I can give on that, because I think there's no uniform consensus on how people of different races prefer to be identified. I'll give you an example. I'm Hispanic, but there are a lot of people that don't like that term. They prefer the term Latino, Latina. There's an issue with those two terms. They're gendered as well. Latino is masculine, Latina is feminine. And so there's this new term that's become increasingly popular called Latinx. and you might have seen it around Latinx. That X stands for any gender. It's not masculine, it's not feminine, but I didn't come of age when this term existed, so I don't really identify it. And then to add to that complexity, some people hate all of those terms and prefer to be just simply an American or a Cuban American or a Mexican American or something else entirely. So the issue of using labels when referring to specific races is extremely complicated, and that's just one. There are other races as well. I don't have an easy answer for that. I would say try to use the term that the audience is using or preferring to use. And if you don't do that, just be very careful. I agree, it's a complicated situation.
I had to get approval to ask that question. I was like, oh, let me think about this. From Sonia White, what would be the correct way to say it when you have a woman chair? Do you say chairperson or chairwoman?
I'd get rid of both of those. I would simply say the chair.
Great. All right. From Shelley Mannon, we know a language is an alive and living entity and changes over time. Perhaps it is time to incorporate gender-neutral terms from other languages. What are your thoughts?
I would have no issue incorporating a gender-neutral term from other languages. The issue is that in the Western world, where there are so many Romance languages, there aren't many options for gender-neutral pronouns in many Romance languages, nor is there in the English language. So I would have to really dig deep to find a language which doesn't use gender as much. I can think of Chinese. In Chinese, they often obscure the noun or the pronoun. It's assumed from the context of the conversation. But that would be a pretty big shift in the English language to go towards having a displayed noun to an assumed noun in context. But if you find a pronoun in another language that works well in English, I will be the first to hop on that.
Okay, this is from Ozzy. Are there any books you recommend? I know psychologist Steven Pinker has done a ton of work on linguistics, but is there anything specifically for inclusive language?
I haven't found the book for public speakers on inclusive language. Maybe you've inspired me to write the next one. I couldn't give just one suggestion. I would say read as many books as you can that are contemporary and see what those authors and writers whom you respect are doing. I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Sun Sentinel, and many articles online. So I notice when those types of norms are starting to shift, but there isn't a consensus yet. I wish I could give you the standard book on gender inclusive language. We're working on that.
Well, we're excited that we're inspiring you to write a book. I think many of the people in this room, including myself, would be reading that. So from Susan Schultz, what do you do about doctor? Is that non-gender?
Absolutely. Doctor is non-gendered in the English language. In some Romance languages, they can gender that title as well. So you would use Dr. Smith, Dr. Jones, Dr. Cortez, regardless of the person's gender. And in fact, most female professors who go by the title doctor and most female physicians who also use the title doctor prefer that term because so often their male colleagues get the distinguished title doctor and they are referred to as Miss or Mrs. despite the fact that they have the same education and training. So that is something I would intentionally use for everyone who's earned that title.
Okay, from Tony Roll, and I really like this one. In an introduction I recently heard, the pronoun alternated between he and she for different sentences. My initial thought was that it was a typo. Any suggestions on what to do if you are a presenter and not sure if it is a typo or not?
That is a complicated question as well, because I don't know if it's a typo or if the person is deliberately trying to include different people without using the pronoun they. So one suggestion that the United Nations had would be to alternate the order in which you use he and she. So if you use he first and then she in one sentence, you switch it to she first and then he in another sentence, so you don't always put the masculine pronoun beforehand. I would simply ask. And if I didn't have a means to ask, I would try my best to include everybody. But I agree with Tony. That's a confusing situation.
Wouldn't it have been better to say they instead of he or she?
That's what I would prefer. I would use they. But remember, there's still slight grammatical awkwardness in using a plural pronoun for a singular person. So that lack of consensus leads to all different strategies, some of which I think are smoother for speech delivery than they are in writing. And using they is much smoother than using he and she.
Okay. So let's see, Verna Bonaby, the Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal, using the word men to encompass both genders. Is that now politically incorrect? And what would you use in place of men in that statement?
It is absolutely politically incorrect. I'm a history teacher by profession. I teach that document written in 1776. I've taught it to several generations of students by now. It is not correct to use the term man to refer to all people. Instead, you would use humans, humanity, humankind, or people rather than man. And in fact, in the French Revolution, there was a famous document called the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And as early as the late 18th century, some woman was offended strongly and came up with the Declaration of the Rights of Woman to counter that, which purposefully excluded half of the audience. So I would say, no, don't use man, except if you're analyzing a historical document, but never use man in the present intentionally. That's exclusive.
I gotta tell you, there's a lot of chatter in here. You're opening up some eyes of people going, oh, I never thought of that. All right, from Rebecca Robin, have you heard of Z-E, as a replacement for he or she? And do you think it might catch on?
Rebecca, it's already catching on, but it's catching on in a very small subset of the community. Z is being used at a lot of liberal arts colleges with small student populations that tend to be politically liberal and extremely progressive in their speech and norms. But that is not representative of the entire nation. These are 18 to 23-year-olds who are in an enclave with other young people who are also progressive. I think we may see it continue to spread in younger and progressive circles, but I wouldn't call Z mainstream yet.
Okay, so there is still a bit of chatter around the chairperson. So we're going to go back to that one. And we're concerned with saying Mr. Chair, Madam Chair Lady, Ms. Chair, because if there are multiple chairs, how do you designate the difference?
If there are multiple chairs, then I would designate the difference by using the person's name after their title. This is similar to the Supreme Court. Throughout from the beginning of this country until the 1980s, people used the term Mr. Justice to refer to Supreme Court justices. And the reason they've done this is because every Supreme Court justice from that time until Sandra Day O'Connor was confirmed was a male. So Mr. Justice was appropriate. Once Sandra Day O'Connor came and diversified the court, that had to get dropped. Sandra Day O'Connor didn't refer to herself as Mr. Justice. The preferred term switched to simply Justice. Justice O'Connor, Justice Rehnquist. And I think chair semantically follows that really, really well. We can easily get rid of the chairman or chairwoman and just use Chair Kinsey, Chair Margolin, Chair Bravim.
Okay. Kay Stay says the Grammar Girl podcast offers great information on gender neutral pronouns, singular and style, just for anybody that wants to read up on that. And I do have one, how to take the guess out of the opportunity. Just ask. Is that politically correct to just ask? Is there a problem with that?
There's no problem at all. And most in the LGBTQ community, who are the most often misgendered, prefer to be asked rather than to be misgendered. So you will offend fewer people by asking than you would by assuming. I would never assume.
And you're getting thumbs up on the chair last name. They like that. So congratulations on that one.
I'm
And
glad
I think I have gone through quite a few of them here. And you're getting kudos all over the side, all over the place. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Let me see if we have any hands raised. No, I think you are looking good. Great presentation. I think it was very eye-opening. I'm trying to figure out how to use Z when we actually present someone. So instead of using Toastmaster, XYZ, you would say ZXYZ?
That's correct. And depending on which college that you're going to, it'll have different levels of acceptability. At a conservative Christian college, you're not going to see Z very much. But at Williams College, you will see Z. So if you're ever invited to do a commencement address or speak in an academic or professional conference at a college, I would look up that university's norms with regard to gender. It's just good habit.
Okay, and Anita Patel asks, what about president? We usually say Madam President or Mr. President in our meetings. Is that okay if we know that person uses traditional genders for themselves? Or should we be all-encompassing and say the same thing consistently?
I have been a member of 4 different Toastmasters club, 1 in Rhode Island, 3 in South Florida, and I have worked under numerous club presidents, and I did find one in one of my clubs who was a female and did not like to be referred to as Madam President, and if that is that person's preference, I would go by what they prefer. But in general, I haven't seen a lot of complaints about using Mr. President or Madam President. But of course, the simple solution would just be to say President Kinsey, President Bravim, President Smith.
Nice. Okay, Hein Green wanted you to know that they cannot thank you enough. The depth of your knowledge in this field is incredibly impressive. And Shelley Mannon.
If anyone wants more information, I have availability. I can share my presentation with you. I can email and have a discussion, or you can get a free copy of my yet to be written book on gender norms and style for public speakers. It's really been my pleasure to be here. I have never given this presentation before, so you all have been my guinea pigs, but you've been very, very good to me. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, and let me know if you need anything else.
All right, well, let's give it up. Yes, you did fabulous. I am going to go ahead and post the link for Lewis's evaluation in the chat box right now. And you're getting lots of kudos, so I'll post it a number of times. And if you want a copy of his presentation, I'm trying to grab some email addresses as we speak, but you can put it on your evaluation, and that guarantees that he will see it. And Lewis, we thank you. District 47 appreciates your time and energy. And let's give it up. Give him a big round of applause. Yes, this was very, very eye-opening. Thank you.
I hear absolutely no applause, but I can feel the love regardless.
All right, I'm going to mute everybody. Let them applause for you. There you go, everyone. Give a big round of applause.
Was sad that between that code and still